Today I'll open with a reading on embracing difficulty from Full Cup, Thirsty Spirit by Karen Horneffer-Ginter. Given that difficulty is inevitable, it's worth finding ways not only to cope with the challenging aspects of life, but also to use them as opportunities for finding our strength, accepting all of who we are, and deepening our sense of compassion for others. When we confront vulnerabilities and limitations within ourselves, rather than trying to push them away, I find it's more fruitful to embrace them with a sense of acceptance and curiosity. Often, the more we open to these places within, the more we're able to respond to life's challenges with confidence, wisdom, and kindness. The author of that passage, Karen Horneffer-Ginter, is our guest speaker today. Dr. Horneffer-Ginter serves as the Associate Dean for Culture and Wellness at West WMU's Homer Stryker School of Medicine. She previously served as the Director of WMU's Integrative Holistic Health and Wellness Program, along with co-founding the Center for Psychotherapy and Wellness in Kalamazoo. The aim of Karen's work is to connect people with the wisdom of their inner life by reclaiming what gets lost amidst the busyness of day-to-day life. Qualities such as stillness, self-care, creativity, joy, humor, gratitude, and compassion. Her intention is to support people in finding a sense of balance and sacredness in their lives. So I'll now hand off to Karen.
Thank you so much for that introduction. And I also just wanted to say that my pronouns are she, her. I'm so happy to be with you all today. I'm going to do a screen share, and let's see if Zoom wants to cooperate. Great, you're seeing my first slide. Is that true? I'll trust you are. I think everyone's muted. So, you know.
Yes, it's true.
Okay, thank you so much. That's always good to know that my reality is also the reality that's being shared by others. I was struck this morning. It's such a beautiful morning here in Kalamazoo, Michigan, for those of you who are local, and really such a lovely morning to think about this topic. And I hope after this service, people have an opportunity to be outside. I'm just so enjoying the sunshine. One of the things I wanted to say just as an introduction is I'm aware that this is a topic that if you heard 1,000 different people talk about, they would each probably talk about it in 1,000 different ways, because there's so many different ways to approach it. What I thought that I would do this morning is, in a sense, to offer you sort of like an appetizer poo-poo platter of some different ideas and strategies that come from the areas of both positive psychology and resiliency, or resilience as it sometimes is termed. And my hope for you as you're listening to me talk about these different ideas is that you focus on identifying one or two takeaways that feel relevant for you today. I wanted to just start with, I don't know if some of you might have seen this in the New York Times this year. I was appreciating this author saying that, obviously this has been such a challenging year for so many reasons in so many different ways. And I don't need to go on about that, but obviously like so much loss and suffering, and in a sense, devastation, maybe at its best, those of us that have sort of gotten through this last year and a half may be feeling this quality of languishing. And the author was sort of encouraging, like, we should probably redust off this word, because it seems to capture this quality of the blah that some of us might be feeling from, again, maybe for many different reasons. But I was struck by, for those of us for which this might be the case, I think it just brings attention in particular to how important this topic of mental well-being is, and just sort of reminding ourselves of some of the tips and the tools that can be helpful in day-to-day life. One of the models that I've really appreciated, and I wanted to share this, and some of you may be familiar with it, is Martin Seligman, who is a psychologist who comes from University of Pennsylvania, has been there for many decades. And he's developed this model that is a sense of what the research says across different domains of functioning and how it can be supportive for us, not only thriving, but flourishing is the word he likes to use. And so I wanted to make some comments across these different domains of what we can do and how to think about, how we can encourage these different facets of our well-being. So we'll talk a bit about positive emotion, engagement, relationships, meaning, the place for accomplishment and achievement, and health and vitality. And again, as I'm talking, pieces of information that feel like they're not all that relevant, just let those kind of wash over you. And again, I kind of charge you with the mission to think about kind of one or two key ideas that might be worth sort of carrying away with you today. One of the ideas that I really appreciate about his work is he'll say, no one element defines well-being, but each of these collectively contributes to our overall well-being. I just wanted to pop this up for a minute, just a fun image that oftentimes is shared with the copyright kind of in the lower right corner, but I just like how visually this helps to bring this model to life. So I wanted to start in with kind of this whole notion of positive emotions. And, one of the things that I'm often aware as a psychologist is sort of happiness can seem like sort of this mysterious quality that for many people, they'd like to attain a bit more of it. And there's always these sort of interesting debates about, well, is happiness most important? And what does happiness even really mean? When we look collectively at some of the research that's been done over the decades, you see this kind of general takeaway that maybe we all have a certain set point range within which our well-being will fall based on sort of different predispositions, whether we want to think about that genetically or biochemically. It's also interesting, though, people tend to predict the influence of life circumstances. And I think it's interesting when you look at this visual that really circumstances, if we generalize across research, only account for 10% of our well-being. Not so much in the moment, but maybe some of you have heard of this classic study where they looked at people that had won the lottery and there was that instant kind of elation. And then if you look at their life a year later, interestingly, not so much of a change as we might expect. So it's interesting that it opens up this window where we can think about 40% of our well-being or our happiness being impacted by intentional activities we might do. I always find that to be encouraging, to be reminded of that. A few other thoughts. So when we think about these are sort of my own ideas. I'm not saying this is particularly based on research, but if we think about increasing positive emotions, we can think about, if we think of that in the past, how might it be possible to cultivate gratitude? Not that we're necessarily happy about everything that's happened to us or that's happening to us, but are there lessons that we've learned? Is there a particular frame where we can think about what we're thankful for? When I think about positive emotions in the present, I think this is part of the popularity of mindfulness right now, trying to encourage ourselves to have tools so that we really can be fully in the present moment. And then when we think about the future, this whole notion of can we foster an optimism? And one of the things I always like to point out is I don't mean by that a false sense of like, everything's going to be great. We should just think positive. But can we find something that is both authentic to what we're actually experiencing in the moment, but also having an optimism that can feel like it's actually true and not just kind of forced? One of the cartoons that I often appreciate sort of around this idea is this, physician saying, here's your problem. It looks like you're paying attention to what's going on. I mean, oftentimes when we're paying attention to what's going on, we are aware of the level of inequity, the level of suffering in the world. It's hard to just have sort of nor would we want a Pollyanna positivity. But I think that it is helpful to think about ways that we can try to harness some of the positivity that does exist in us. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. One of the things I've appreciated is this research by someone named Barbara Fredrickson. And she talks about when we think of positivity and like what we're going for, that ideally, not that we can always control this, but we would have 3 times the positive emotions in life as negative emotions. And I'm sorry for the overly text-filled slides here. But this notion that, for every time we have a heart-wrenching emotion, if there's a way heart-wrenching emotion, if there's a way we can experience something positive, that balance overall, based on research, shows that that tends to create positive well-being. The takeaway that I appreciate about this is, can we look to see if we can decrease some of the gratuitous or unnecessary negativity? So I'll notice in life, something happens, I have my negative response. I'm not trying to not have that because that feels authentic to my experience as a human being. But then if I notice I'm like continuing to milk that, or for instance, I'll sort of use the word with myself sometimes, like I'm continuing to pout about it, at some point, does it make sense to try to sort of stop that cycle? And one of the things that she points out is that we can get into these patterns where it's like our negativity just sort of spawns more negativity. And so this is where it can be helpful to sort of catch ourselves and dispute that negative thinking. So, that's maybe an interesting idea. I know sometimes when I've heard that, I've thought, okay, there's a takeaway for myself with that. I wanted to also add with this a few comments about resilience, because this is certainly a very kind of hot topic right now. Traditionally, resilience is defined as a sort of ability to bounce back from difficult circumstances, but it also is often looked at proactively, thinking about how we can prepare for what might be stressful, how we can cope with things in life that are stressful by maximizing our thoughts and our actions and our resources. One of the comments I just wanted to make is I think there's sort of some pros and cons to this topic. Like I noticed at the medical school with physicians and students, it's both like an appreciated topic and sort of a hated topic, because sometimes you see resilience being kind of thrown out by organizations kind of as a way of saying, we don't need to change anything structurally. It's just all about you. You just have to be a little bit more hardy, and you can imagine the sort of danger that comes when resilience is kind of twisted in that way. So I just wanted to name that. I still all the same think that there's some value sort of thinking about resilience. One of the things that's interesting, because I think this is getting so much attention, people sometimes look at this in kind of a mysterious, magical way, like, what do I have to do to be resilient? And one of the things that you notice if you start to look at the information and the research is some of resiliency just basically connects us back to the things that we've known for years, that we need to make sure we're giving attention to some of these self-care basics in our life. And of course, this pie could be divided up in different ways. And there's probably some dimensions that are missing on here in terms of things that are most important and valuable to each of you. But the thing that I always like to remember is like this information, I absolutely know. I know that I know it, but I'm always struck by how there's such a difference between knowing it and actually embodying it and living it. And so I know for myself, and I've sort of just been able to find kind of a sense of humor about this, just sort of that humbly, I really like every week have to ask myself the question, Karen, that exercise is good for you. How many, minutes, hours have you spent this week exercising? That sleep is good for you. How much sleep are you getting? And I just sort of think it's interesting that we often, if we don't have someone asking us those questions in our life, sometimes we need to pause and ask ourselves to make sure that we're sort of engaging in the best of what our wisdom is that we would give to others. This is kind of interesting. I just want to put this up. This was sort of a summary article saying, if you look at characteristics of people that tend to score high in resiliency, you see that they tend to have a positive, realistic outlook, kind of a moral compass intact, a sense of sort of, what's valued, what's right and good, a belief in something greater than themselves, a sense of altruism, a capacity to have acceptance for what we cannot change, and a way to kind of focus that energy around change that we want to create. Having a sense of a mission and meaning, we'll talk more about that, and having a social support system. And when I mention these things, it's not so much to have us like look at this and say, oh no, then it's hopeless because I don't have all these qualities. But I find it sort of interesting to look at this list and see if there's something on here that might make sense to focus some energy around. Like if we realize, like having a mission and a meaning and a purpose, that's been harder to find in this past year and a half or 2 years, or that's been harder to find since I moved into retirement, then thinking about, is there a way to reconnect with that in our life? I just want to name that sometimes with these models of resilience, like this is one that comes out of University of Pennsylvania, you'll see this focus on different cognitive capacities, different interpersonal capacities. This could be sort of a whole different talk, but I just wanted to name sort of 3 areas that I think are really helpful just to plant these as seeds if ever it's something anyone wants to explore a little bit more deeply. You see in resilience this focus on wanting to think about our thinking. So wanting to take a moment to step back and look at what are my patterns, and is there something that I can do to make sure I'm maximizing the way that I'm going about thinking. Thinking again, mindfulness kind of comes up, and I think that's something again that there's a lot of desire in our culture and a lot of offerings around learning those tools right now. And then self-compassion, and I'll sort of talk about that a little bit more. I just want to first say kind of an example of this sort of thinking about our thinking. I really appreciate this classic work by Judith Dweck, who talked about, what's the difference between having a fixed versus a growth mindset, and how many of us were raised. I know I was sort of raised this way with more of a fixed mindset, meaning like, if I have a skill or not, it's because I was born with it. If I don't do well, then that just makes me feel sad. What do I do with that? There's really this encouragement, and we really, really encourage this at the medical school of sort of embracing, it's all a process, and we can keep growing and we can keep changing. One of the other ideas I did want to elaborate on for a moment is this quality of self-compassion. Kristen Neff and Christopher Germer have a model that I think is really helpful, where they define self-compassion as having these 3 components of bringing a kindness to ourselves, connecting with our common humanity, and bringing in this tool of mindfulness. And I really appreciate how they highlight what that looks like in contrast to our typical stress response, which is something challenging happens, and maybe we feel overly self-critical, or maybe we tend to isolate and pull back versus seeking and seeing our connection with others, or our mind tends to sort of ruminate and just cycle through the same thoughts versus having this quality of mindfulness. So I just wanted to sort of plant that as a seed, if that kind of piques your curiosity and interest, and this is new information to you, there's wonderful resources by these authors to be able to explore. Let me take a little sip of water. I want to move over to engagement. So this is sort of an interesting one. Thinking of engagement, of how is it that we sort of fully deploy our skills and our strengths to be able to meet a challenging moment, or sort of any moment in life. Maybe many of you or some of you have heard of this work called Flow by Macaulay Csikszentmihalyi. This research that showed that when people are in the moment and they're fully engaged, that's actually when they're the happiest, even more so than if we were all just sort of chilling on our couch, watching TV. It's interesting that people are not as happy in terms of what they report as they are in moments when they're actually this fully engaged. It's interesting that part of the quality of what people find that maybe explains why this is so satisfying is when we're in flow, it's almost like we lose ourselves because we're so absorbed in the moment, because it's requiring us to bring our skill set into that moment. And people can find this across a variety of playing musical instruments, playing sports, engaged in certain work tasks or hobbies that feel meaningful. It's just interesting to think about in life where possibly you feel that quality of engagement, what it looks like to bring that to life, both professionally and personally. I know that differs for each of us. And I know that it's not that really like every day we necessarily can have these ultimate like flow moments, but it's interesting just to ask ourselves, is there a way that we can relate to the tasks we're doing that gives us more of a quality of more fully showing up, or maybe right now we're kind of missing an opportunity to feel more fully alive. Relationships. This is always a tricky one, because oftentimes relationships are considered the number one buffer to stress, but they also end up being the number one cause of stress. And sometimes those can be one and the same relationships that can function in the same way, like across time, or even sometimes like in the same moment. I think sometimes parenting can be described that way. I just really appreciate this sort of quote here. This is from Martin Seligman. If evolution had to rely on maximizing happiness, the human race would have died out a long time ago. I just think that's kind of funny. So, when we think about relationships, of course, there's what we can control and what we can't control. I think that usually, like all of us would say, yeah, I'd love to have amazing relationships and have no one in my life be causing me stress. Not so much I can do about that. But it is sort of interesting to think about some of the variables that we can at least give consideration to in case there are sort of small things or small ways we can focus our energy to try to improve and maximize our relationships in our life. For some of us, I think there's a preference for the sort of one-on-one close connections. For others, it's about a sense of larger community. Being a part of this church community is a great example. I think of in relationships how the research has consistently shown the importance of having a reciprocity in relationships. So for those of us in particular who are helpers, do we also have places in life where maybe we help, but we're also being helped and we have that coming back? Is there a way of creating a quality of trust, or if trust has ruptured, really looking at that so we can feel safe in our relationships? Communication is always so important in both partnerships and work relationships. That's kind of a huge topic in and of itself. But one of the research findings that I've always appreciated is for how predictive it is to the quality of a relationship, the capacity to be with each other in times of sorrow. It's actually been shown to be even more important, this capacity to be with each other in times of joy. And think about that. Like the next time you have someone come to you and share good news, think about how important it is to be able to fully show up in that moment and celebrate with them. Just think that's kind of an interesting takeaway. Meaning, I think, is one of the most kind of intriguing topics and kind of facets of well-being. Meaning has been correlated with both psychological health and physical health. There sort of was a very interesting recent article that looked at a correlation or a predictive quality of meaning in predicting mortality. Happy to share that article reference with anyone who's interested. I like how Martin Seligman defines a sense of meaning and purpose is being able to feel a sense of belonging and serving something that's bigger than ourselves. And you often see that quality of sort of bigger than ourselves being something across different components of meaning. I think the reason why that's helpful to remember is in moments where we feel a lack of meaning, sometimes it can help to recognize, maybe we're thinking in too small of a way, or maybe we're sort of, the mind tends to be so self-referential and sort of self-consumed that maybe by kind of recognizing our place in the larger context of life, ways that we can serve and be connected to things that feel like they're beyond, myself as an individual, that can be a helpful reminder. I really appreciate the work of Viktor Frankl, and probably some of you have read Man's Search for Meaning and know of his work that came from the time of the Holocaust. One of the ideas that he has that I think that's really interesting. It's arguable, but kind of interesting. He says, there's 3 different primary ways that we can find meaning. One is through having this active life where we engage in creative work. There's also having what he calls a more passive life, where it's not that we're necessarily generative in creating what's meaningful, but we're taking in the beauty and the creativity of others. And then the third category, kind of in his model, is saying, we also can find meaning when we're able to find something valuable or meaningful, even in the face of unavoidable suffering. And certainly this came out of the context of his experience being in a concentration camp. One of the things that I also just wanted to plant this idea, because I just always find it fascinating. He says that he feels like when people are unable to find meaning, it's then and only then that they turn to either power or they turn to pleasure. And I just think that that's interesting sometimes if we look at our own behavior or we look at the behavior of others to think, are there moments when someone is like kind of going for something, either in the kind of name of power or pleasure, not that there's anything necessarily wrong with power or pleasure, but that underlying that there's something around meaning that might be missing or something around meaning that should be considered. The other point that he made later in his life that I always have found fascinating is sort of this sense that sometimes we can have a lack of meaning out of feeling sort of an existential vacuum, almost like feeling more underwhelmed versus feeling overwhelmed. And I won't read through this whole quote, but I just want to say that his point was how sometimes in psychology, we have this sense of wanting to help people get to this place of like a nirvana peacefulness, and that if they were to feel that, they would ultimately feel greater well-being. But he would say, you know, that's not really true. It's actually sort of healthy to have a gap in perceiving where you want to be and a discrepancy between where you are and where you want to be. So there's something that's moving and motivating you to keep growing and flourishing. Just an interesting idea. It's a little bit like if you've ever seen that graph called the Yerkes-Dodson law, that you need sort of like an optimal level of engagement and anxiety to perform well, whether that's in sports and other things. So I just wanted to toss that idea out in case that's anyone's takeaway for the day. I just also wanted to name, and what's interesting in Seligman's work, he circled back and added in this category of achievement and accomplishment, because he didn't originally have this in his model. And there were some people who challenged him saying, you know, sometimes people pursue activities, not because they make them feel better, not because they want the connection, they really just want the achievement. And it's interesting, sometimes you see this with people who are competitive around a particular activity, and you see that they put so much into developing their skillfulness, and that there's something about that love of wanting to accomplish or achieve a goal that in and of itself can lend something helpful to our well-being. I think of this sometimes, this idea in psychology of having outcomes be ego syntonic or ego dystonic, meaning is the outcome something that is pleasing to us because it reinforces the way that we want to see ourselves? Or is the outcome something that is unpleasing to us because it really causes us to have to look at ourselves in a different way than how we want to see ourselves? And so sometimes for people that are competitive and kind of channel their energy and their time into something, there can be something just really, truly so satisfying about kind of getting the trophy, metaphorically speaking, at the end of the day. The other piece that I just want to offer that I think is kind of obvious, I mean, we're talking about mental wellness. You know, obviously physical wellness is hugely informative as to how we feel emotionally, just as I realize that that connection goes both ways, and how we feel emotionally and mentally impacts our physical well-being. You know, when I think about health and vitality, I feel like there's this whole piece of whatever symptoms we might be experiencing in our physical bodies, whatever kind of chronic illnesses we have, are there ways that we can be managing those symptoms so that we feel a higher quality of life? I think there's also these questions about, okay, that's one piece of well-being, but then can we optimize our physical well-being as well? And so that kind of brings us back to, you know, again, I think of it as the basics that we're often told in life and that most of us know. And it's a matter of sort of reminding ourselves of these different activities that are so important. You know, sometimes I laugh because I think it's a little bit hard with people who are busy in particular to figure out how to be in relationship to these topics. They're so important. So it's sort of ridiculous to leave them out. But if you go and you remind someone like, hey, you know, have you exercised? Are you eating in a healthy way? Are you getting sleep? It seems so obvious that it can be a little bit almost insulting. But then it's also the reality that for so many people, their schedules are so busy that it's really challenging to find the time to be able to take care of ourselves in these ways. So then it can be a little bit irritating, as though it's somehow a simple thing to go through a very busy work week and get enough sleep, or to be able to have time to prep and cook food. So I just find this to always be kind of it's an interesting topic because it seems so basic, but really it's worthy, you know, of a whole kind of session or workshop in and of itself, of just looking at ways that we can maximize those activities. Relaxation is certainly another one, especially, I mean, I'm saying the obvious, but I think in a day and a time and a place where we have such a quick pace for so many of us that we're kind of moving at, and we have so many kind of micro sound bites of information constantly coming our way, it's too easy to kind of lose this art of what it even means to relax, what it even means to unplug. I'm grateful in some ways for some of the apps that exist, like the Calm, the Headspace, that sort of helps people have a way to structure that in their life. But certainly, you know, we don't have to do that only in apps. You know, one of the things that I've always appreciated is this idea of making sure that we're taking breaks. And this is an image, you might not be able to see all the writing on this, but actually it's at the website for the book I wrote years ago, that Full Cup Thirsty Spirit, that you're happy to print it out from there if you ever want this. But I had an illustrator create this just to think of ways that didn't have to do with a computer or a phone or a screen, that we hopefully, without having to spend money or much money, can just take a break. And that sometimes the time isn't going to come where everything on our to-do list is complete, that really we have to kind of get in the habit of inserting breaks in the middle of our day, in the middle of that list. And I find for myself, when it's time that I most need a break, my mind can't even remember how to take a break because I'll be so focused on what I'm doing. So the idea of this is just to have an image to sort of remind yourself, like, okay, this is something that I could do. So I just want to circle back in closing to say, as we talked about these different dimensions of well-being, positive emotions, how to think about that, how to think about this notion of resilience, the place for engagement, relationships, meaning, accomplishments, achievement, health, vitality, kind of the notion that it's no one of these things, but really the combination of all of these things that informs our well-being. I really would ask for you, you don't have to say this out loud, you don't have to put it in the chat, but just to think about, like, of all these different ideas I just shared over these last 20 minutes or so, what is a takeaway that you'd want to carry with you today, whether it's sort of a reminder, and maybe a reminder you want to put on a sticky note and put the sticky note somewhere that you're going to encounter in the next few days, or maybe it's even an action, like something that you're like, maybe I should give that a try, or maybe I should think a little bit more about that. So whatever that one thing is, sort of like carry that with you. I just want to encourage that. And again, thank you all. I just appreciate, I know it's a commitment in a sense to take time on a Sunday morning to show up for something that's about taking a step back in life and just reflecting on all the things that are most important for each of you. And so I just also want to just kind of commend you for that commitment, both to yourself and for your community and for that which you most care about. And so nice to be with you during this time.